She wasn't supposed to fall in love with him. She was supposed to clean his floors, keep her head down, and disappear. But the night-armed men stormed the ballroom and Damien Ashcroft threw his body in front of hers. Bleeding, broken, refusing to let go. Amara Brooks understood that some choices don't ask for your permission. They just happen. And they cost everything. This is not a fairy tale. This is the story of a woman the world wrote off, and the most dangerous man alive who couldn't look away. Stay until the end. Like, comment, and tell me. What city are you watching from? I want to see how far this story travels. The flight from Chicago took 11 hours, and by the time Amara Brooks dragged her worn suitcase through the arrivals terminal at Heathrow, she had exactly $43 left in her checking account. She knew the number precisely because she had checked 3 times at O'Hare, standing at the gate with her boarding pass crumpled in her fist, doing the kind of math that poor people know how to do in their sleep. $43, no return ticket. A mother back home with 3 months of overdue mortgage, and a brother who needed school supplies and a winter coat before October hit. She didn't let herself cry in the terminal. She had already done that at the cemetery. Her father's funeral had been 2 weeks ago. 41 people showed up, which surprised her, because Raymond Brooks had been a quiet man, a careful man, the kind of man who fixed things with his hands and never complained about the pain in his back until the pain became something worse, and by then it was too late. He left behind a wife, 2 kids, and a pile of debt that Amara hadn't known existed until the bank envelopes started arriving daily and her mother stopped opening them. She found the job listing on an agency website at 2 in the morning, sitting at her kitchen table with cold coffee and a calculator. Housekeeping position, overseas placement, competitive salary. The listing said the employer required discretion, punctuality, and an ability to work independently. It said nothing about the man who owned the house. She looked him up afterward when the agency confirmed her interview. Damien Ashcroft. 37 years old, billionaire. His face stared out from Forbes covers and financial headlines with the expression of someone who had never once in his life been told no by anyone who mattered. Dark eyes, hard jaw, the kind of handsome that looked like a warning. She almost withdrew her application that same night. Instead, she submitted her references and booked the cheapest available flight. The car that met her at arrivals was a black Mercedes that smelled like leather polish and money. The driver didn't speak. He loaded her single suitcase into the trunk without being asked, held the door open, and did not look at her once during the 2-hour drive north through countryside that grew progressively more isolated and gray. Rain had been falling since morning. The fields outside the window looked exhausted. Amara kept her hands folded in her lap and watched the road. The estate revealed itself gradually, the way a threat does. First the stone wall, maybe 8 feet tall, running along the roadside for what felt like a quarter mile before the iron gates appeared. Then the gates themselves swinging inward without the driver touching anything, some remote mechanism she couldn't see. Then the driveway, crushed gravel, perfectly edged, cutting through grounds that were immaculate and somehow cheerless, the kind of manicured landscape that exists to impress rather than comfort. And finally, the house. She had looked at photographs. The photographs were insufficient. Ashcroft Estate stood 4 stories tall, all dark stone in severe angles, with wings extending on both sides like arms opened not in welcome but in containment. Every window was lit from within, but not warmly. The light that came through the glass was controlled, deliberate, the same way everything about this place was controlled and deliberate. Amara counted the chimneys out of habit. 7. She didn't know what that told her, but it told her something. The driver parked and left her at the front steps without a word. The door opened before she could knock. The woman who answered was maybe 60, with silver hair pulled back tight and eyes that assessed Amara in the span of a single second. Not unkindly, but completely. "Miss Brooks." Not a question. "I'm Mrs. Holloway, head of household staff. Your arrival was expected at 4:30. It is now 20 minutes to 5. "Traffic," Amara said. "The weather," Mrs. Holloway corrected in a tone that closed the subject. "Come in, leave your bag. Someone will bring it up." The entrance hall was larger than the apartment Amara had grown up in. Black and white marble floors, a staircase that curved upward in both directions, a chandelier overhead made of something that caught the light in 100 different ways and offered none of it back as warmth. The air inside the house smelled like beeswax and cut flowers, and underneath both of those, something older, something the furniture polish was trying to cover. Mrs. Holloway walked without looking back to see if Amara was following, which told Amara she was expected to keep up. She kept up. The tour was efficient and made it clear what she was and was not permitted to know. The East Wing housed the kitchen, staff quarters, laundry, and storage. The ground floor contained the formal dining room, 2 sitting rooms, a breakfast room, and a library. The upper floors held guest accommodations and the private residence of Mr. Ashcroft, which Amara would never enter. She would clean everything else on a rotation, 6 days per week, with Sundays free. She was not to discuss the household with anyone outside the estate. She was not to answer questions from anyone she did not recognize. She was not to enter the West Wing under any circumstances. "What's in the West Wing?" Amara asked. Mrs. Holloway stopped walking and turned around slowly. "I said you were not to enter it." "I heard you. I asked what was in it." The older woman held her gaze for a moment. Whatever calculation was happening behind those eyes resolved quickly. "Mr. Ashcroft's private workspace. He requires absolute solitude there. Absolute. If you open that door, your employment ends immediately, without reference, without severance. Do you understand?" "Yes," Amara said. "Good." Mrs. Holloway began walking again. "Dinner for staff is at 7. You'll meet the others tonight. Get some rest. You begin tomorrow at 5:30. Her room was in the East Wing, small but clean, with a single window overlooking the service yard and a narrow bed with good linen. There was a small desk, a wooden chair, a mirror above the dresser. Amara sat on the edge of the bed and pressed both hands flat against her thighs and did not move for a long time. She took out her phone and texted her mother. "Arrive safe. Place is something else. I'll call Sunday." Her mother replied in 30 seconds. "Thank God. Love you. Be good." Amara put the phone face down on the mattress and stared at the ceiling, and thought about what $43 felt like, and what $12,000 a year felt like, which was the salary she had accepted, which was more money than she had ever made in a single year, which still seemed like not quite enough when she calculated what her mother owed and what Marcus needed, and what the rest of the family's survival actually cost in cold, hard numbers. But it was something. It was real. And Amara Brooks had built her entire adult life on the understanding that something real was always better than nothing at all. She washed her face, changed her clothes, and went down to meet the staff at 7. There were 8 of them. Mrs. Holloway at the head of the table, 4 housemaids including Amara, a groundskeeper named Tobias who spoke in 3-word sentences, a cook named Jean who was French and warm and clearly the emotional center of the staff, and a young woman named Priya who had been there 6 months and sat beside Amara and spoke quietly without moving her lips much, which Amara recognized immediately as a survival skill. "Don't make noise," Priya said over the soup. "Don't ask questions. Don't be in the hallway when he comes through." "Does he come through often?" "You'll know it when he does. The whole temperature of the house changes." She paused. "He's not cruel. He's just very—" She searched for the word. "Present. Like when he's in a room, the room knows it." Amara thought about that. "Have you ever spoken to him directly?" "Once. I dropped a tray outside the dining room and it made an enormous noise and he appeared and I thought I was finished." Priya's spoon moved in small circles in her bowl. "He told me to clean it up and be more careful in future, that was all. But the way he said it." She shook her head slightly. "It stayed with me." Amara slept that night with the window cracked despite the cold, the way she always did, needing to hear something alive outside. Rain on gravel, wind through the hedges. Her grandmother had taught her that years ago in Mississippi. "Keep one ear on the outside world, baby. Rooms can swallow you whole if you let them." She thought about her grandmother often in those first 2 weeks, about the woman's hands, specifically, thick-knuckled and impossibly precise, moving through repairs and alterations and restorations with the patience of someone who understood that damaged things were not destroyed things. Her grandmother had repaired furniture, jewelry, fabric, small sculptures from estate sales, had passed that knowledge on to Amara the same way she passed on her recipes, through repetition and touch and the occasional sharp correction when Amara rushed. Don't force it. Let it tell you what it needs. The work at Ashcroft Estate was not difficult. It was constant and physical and required attention, but Amara had been working since she was 16 and her body knew how to endure. What took adjustment was the silence. The estate had a particular quality of quiet that pressed against you differently than ordinary quiet. as though the house itself were listening. She caught glimpses of Damien Ashcroft 3 times in those first 2 weeks. Never close, always at a distance. Once crossing the entrance hall, dark suit, phone to his ear, footsteps that made no sound on the marble. Once through the window, walking the grounds alone at dusk, hands clasped behind his back, head down, moving like a man conducting an argument with himself. Once at the top of the main staircase, speaking quietly to a man in a gray suit whom she had never seen before and never saw again. He was not what she had expected from the photographs. The photographs captured the surface of him, the composure and the wealth. In person, there was something underneath the surface that the camera had not caught, something dense and carefully held. She told herself she wasn't curious about it. She focused on the floors, the glass, the endless surfaces that needed constant maintenance to remain acceptable in this particular house. The crystal crane was on the mantelpiece in the second sitting room, positioned slightly apart from the other objects on either side of it, which she understood now was because it mattered differently than everything else. She had dusted around it carefully for 12 days without incident. On the 13th day, a Thursday, she misjudged the distance in poor morning light, caught the edge of the pedestal with her cloth, and watched the sculpture tip forward, strike the marble hearth, and shatter. The sound was small, which made it worse somehow. She stood over the pieces for a full minute. Her first instinct was a specific kind of cold panic she recognized from childhood, the particular dread of breaking something that someone else valued and having no way to make it right. Her second instinct was to sweep it up and say nothing and hope the absence went unnoticed. She did neither. She photographed every fragment with her phone, labeled the image file by date and time, wrapped the pieces carefully in her cleaning cloth, and brought the bundle to Mrs. Holloway's office. "The crane in the second sitting room," she said. "It was an accident." Mrs. Holloway's face went through several expressions quickly. What settled was something that looked less like anger than dread. "How bad?" "Multiple fractures, the main body, the wings, the tailpiece. The base appears intact. Mr. Ashcroft's father gave him that." The words landed where they were meant to. "I know," Amar said, though she hadn't known until that moment. "I'd like to repair it." "You can't repair that." "I've done similar work. I need proper adhesive, some fine-grade tools, possibly a lamp and a magnifier. If you can give me 3 days before you tell him, I'll show you what I can do." Mrs. Holloway looked at her for a long time. "He has to be informed immediately." "Then let me be present when you do it." She was not present. She was summoned. The message came through Priya at 9 that evening. Mr. Ashcroft wanted to see her. Study. Now. The study was at the end of the east corridor on the ground floor, not the west wing, which surprised her. A single lamp burned on the desk. The rest of the room held itself in shadow, shelves of books going floor to ceiling, a fireplace with the fire reduced to coals, a leather chair that had been sat in 10,000 times and remembered everyone. Damien Ashcroft was standing at the window with his back to her when she came in. He let her stand there. 15 seconds. Maybe 20. Long enough to feel it. Then he turned. Up close, the composure she had observed from a distance was even more apparent and even less reassuring. His face gave nothing away. His eyes moved over her once, the same rapid assessment Mrs. Holloway had performed at the front door, but where Mrs. Holloway's had been efficient, his was something else, more precise, more personal. "You broke it," he said. Not a question, not an accusation, just a statement, delivered flatly. "Yes," Amara said. She did not apologize. She had decided on the way down the hall that she would not lead with apology. "It was an accident. I take responsibility for it." "Good." He moved from the window to the desk and stood behind it, which she recognized was not accidental, the desk as a line of demarcation. "Mrs. Holloway says you want to repair it." "I can repair it." "You're a housekeeper." "I'm also someone who knows how to restore things. My grandmother taught me. I have done more complex repairs than what's broken on that mantelpiece." Something shifted in his expression. Not warmth, not interest exactly, something that was the beginning of attention. "Why didn't you conceal it?" he asked. "Because it would have been found eventually." "That's the practical answer. What's the real one?" She looked at him directly. His eyes were darker than they appeared in photographs, and steadier than seemed comfortable. "Because something that belonged to your father deserved better than to be swept up and forgotten," she said, "and because hiding damage doesn't fix it." The silence that followed had weight to it. You have 3 days, Damien Ashcroft said finally. You'll work in the east sitting room with whatever materials you need. Mrs. Holloway will provide them. If the repair is unacceptable, your employment here ends without prejudice, and I'll provide a full reference regardless. He turned back toward the window. That's all. Amara didn't move immediately. What was its name? She asked. The Crane. He turned his head slightly but didn't fully look at her. My father called it the Patient One. He said it had survived everything he put it through and come out better for it. She nodded once and left. She worked for 3 days with barely 4 hours of sleep each night, operating under the lamp in the east sitting room with the door closed and the fragments laid out on a velvet cloth in the order of their breaking, reconstructing the logic of the original form before she touched a single piece. Her grandmother's voice in her head the whole time. Don't force it. Read it first. A break tells you exactly what happened if you pay attention. The main fracture along the body she reinforced with a fine interior pin, invisible from outside. The wing joints she rebuilt with a 2-part adhesive mixed to the precise consistency the material required. Hairline cracks she traced with a magnifying glass and sealed from the inside out. When she was finished, she sanded the repair sites to seamlessness and polished the whole piece by hand until the light moved across it the same way it had before, or near enough that only someone who knew where to look would find the difference. On the evening of the 3rd day, she carried the restored crane to Mrs. Holloway and set it down on the office desk between them. Mrs. Holloway leaned close, didn't speak for a long time. Where? She said finally. Left wing, lower joint. You can see it at this angle in direct light. I would never have found that. Someone who loved the original might. She didn't see Damien Ashcroft's reaction that evening, but the following morning, when she arrived in his study to clean, the crystal crane was no longer on the mantelpiece in the sitting room. It was on the center of his desk, positioned where the lamplight hit it directly, turned so that the restored wing faced outward. He had placed it exactly where he would see it every time he sat down to work. Amara dusted around it carefully and said nothing. But something had shifted in the house, subtle as a change in air pressure before a storm rolls in, and she felt it in her chest the rest of that day. She told herself it was the cold. She told herself the estate's particular silence was just settling around her the way it settled around everyone who worked here long enough. She told herself a lot of things that week that she was already starting not to believe. And then, on a quiet Sunday afternoon, when the rest of the staff had retreated to their own corners of the estate and the grounds were silver with frost, she turned a corner in the east corridor and nearly walked directly into Damien Ashcroft. He stopped. She stopped. They were close enough that she could see the faint shadow of exhaustion under his eyes, something the tailored clothes and controlled posture did not quite conceal. He looked at her the way he had in the study, that same particular attention. "Thank you," he said, quietly. Not like a man thanking an employee. Before she could form a response, his phone rang in his jacket pocket. He glanced at the screen and his entire expression closed like a door shutting. He answered it in a language she didn't recognize and walked away without looking back, his footsteps disappearing in the direction of the west wing. And somewhere behind that door, behind the door she was absolutely forbidden to open, she heard another voice answer him. Low, male, and unmistakably afraid. She didn't sleep that night. Amara lay on her narrow bed in the east wing with her eyes open and the ceiling above her doing nothing useful, and she thought about the voice behind the west wing door. Not Damien's voice. The other one. The one that had answered him in that low, compressed register that she had heard before in her life. Twice. Both times from men who were being asked questions they did not want to answer. Her father had never been that kind of man. Raymond Brooks had been gentle and consistent, and occasionally too stubborn for his own good, but he had never once in her memory spoken with the particular controlled fear she had heard through that door. She knew what that sound meant because she had grown up in a neighborhood where it was common, where men spoke that way to other men who held something over them, something heavier than money, heavier than pride. She turned onto her side and stared at the wall. The house was making its nighttime sounds around her, the old stone contracting in the cold, wind finding the gaps in the window frames that the maintenance schedule hadn't caught yet. Somewhere below, a door. Then silence. She told herself it was none of her concern. She almost believed it by morning. The following days developed a rhythm that was almost ordinary. Almost. She worked her rotation, kept her head down, exchanged the minimal necessary conversation with the other staff, and applied the full force of her attention to not thinking about the West Wing or the voice behind it or the way Damien Ashcroft had said thank you on that frost-covered corridor, like the word cost him something real to produce. Priya noticed. Of course she did. You've gone quiet, Priya said one morning over breakfast, watching Amara move eggs around a plate she wasn't really eating from. I'm always quiet. You're a different kind of quiet now. Before you were contained. Now you're somewhere else. Amara looked at her. How long have you worked here? 6 months? Have you ever seen anyone go into the West Wing besides him? Priya set her fork down with a care that was its own answer. She looked at the doorway, confirmed Mrs. Holloway wasn't visible, and leaned forward by about 2 inches. 3 times, she said. Men in suits. Different men each time. They arrive late, after 9, and the cars park at the back. No uniforms, no logos. They don't interact with any of us. She paused. Once I saw one of them leaving at 2 in the morning, and he was holding a briefcase and walking the way people walk when they want to be somewhere else very quickly. Did you ask anyone about it? I asked Tobias. What did he say? He said he'd been here 4 years, and the first thing he learned was that some doors exist for the specific purpose of not being opened, and some questions exist for the specific purpose of not being asked. Priya picked her fork back up. Then he went back to pruning something. Amara considered that. Smart man. Terrifyingly smart man, Priya agreed. But the question didn't leave. It just moved further back in her mind, below the threshold of immediate preoccupation, and sat there the way things sit when they're waiting for the right moment. The right moment came on a Wednesday, 3 weeks into her employment, during a heavy rainstorm that kept the grounds unusable and pushed all of them indoors. Amara was working the library, 3rd floor east, a room that required particular patience because of the sheer surface area involved, and because every object in it appeared to have been placed with intent and resented being disturbed. She was working the upper shelves from a rolling ladder when she heard footsteps in the corridor outside, heavier than staff, moving with purpose. She stayed very still on the ladder. The footsteps passed, then stopped. Then, after a pause, continued toward the staircase that led to the ground floor. She descended the ladder carefully and moved to the library door, opened it a fraction. The corridor was empty, but at the far end, the door to a small study she hadn't been assigned to clean yet stood open by several inches, and through it came the sound of a conversation that someone was taking great care to keep below the level that would carry. She should have gone back to the ladder. She stood in the doorway instead, one hand on the frame, not moving closer, just listening with the specific attention her grandmother had taught her to apply to things that mattered. 2 voices. Damien's, which she had now heard enough times to recognize from its cadence alone. And another, British, clipped at the edges, carrying the particular texture of someone accustomed to delivering bad news professionally. The Morrow account isn't the concern. The concern is what they found attached to it. I'm aware of what they found. Then you understand the position this creates. If the Zurich partners will be managed. That's not your problem. A pause. With respect, sir, it may become everyone's problem if the timeline... I said it will be managed. Damien's voice didn't rise. That was the thing about it. It never rose. It just compressed, like pressure building in a sealed space. What I need from you is the name. That's all. The name and confirmation of the connection, and you're done. Another pause, longer. I don't have the name yet. Then I suggest you get it. Footsteps crossing the floor. Amara pulled back from the door and moved smoothly back to the ladder and was 3 rungs up and reaching for the shelf duster when the study door opened fully and the second man walked past the library entrance without looking in. Mid-50s, gray at the temples, the kind of face that had learned to show only what it intended. He disappeared toward the stairs. Damien appeared in the library doorway 30 seconds later. Amara kept her hands moving on the shelf. Miss Brooks. She turned as though she had not heard him coming. Mr. Ashcroft. His eyes covered the room in one sweep. Read her face in another. How long have you been in here? About 40 minutes. I started with the west shelves, and I'm working east. Something moved through his expression that she couldn't fully name. Calculation, partly. and underneath that, something more careful. The upper shelves can wait, he said. Come down. She came down the ladder and stood in front of him on the Persian carpet with the duster in her hand and her pulse doing things she didn't want it to do. You didn't hear anything, he said. It was not phrased as a question. It was phrased as an instruction. I'm here to clean the library, Amara said. That's all I'm doing. The silence between them had a specific quality, like the silence before the first note of something you haven't heard before and don't yet know if you'll recognize. Good, he said finally. He left. She went back up the ladder. Her hands were completely steady, which surprised her because her chest was doing something loud and inconvenient the entire time. The gala was announced the following week. Mrs. Holloway delivered the information at the staff dinner on Monday with the brisk efficiency of someone issuing military orders. Annual corporate event, held on the estate grounds. 200 guests expected. Catering staff supplemented from outside. Every member of household staff on active duty from 4 in the afternoon until the last guest departed, which based on previous years was not before 2 in the morning. The atmosphere at the table shifted immediately. Not excitement. The particular tightening that comes when the ordinary structure of your life gets interrupted by something that brings powerful strangers into your space. Priya leaned toward Amara that night in the corridor outside their rooms. The gala is the hardest night of the year, she said. These aren't ordinary guests. They're, she seemed to be selecting the right word with great care, complicated people. Some of them are here for legitimate business. Some of them are here because this is the one night the estate opens its doors and they want to see inside. She looked at Amara directly. Stay close to Mrs. Holloway's sight line. Don't be alone with any of the male guests. Don't accept anything offered to you by anyone you don't know. Has something happened before? Priya's jaw tightened slightly. Not to me. To someone who was here before I arrived. She didn't elaborate. Amara thought about that for a long time after she closed her door. The gala itself was, on the surface, exactly what it appeared to be. 200 people in expensive clothes moving through a ballroom that had been transformed over 3 days into something that pressed against the edges of opulence without quite crossing into vulgarity. An orchestra. Champagne. A catering operation that moved with military precision through the serving corridors. Damien Ashcroft at the center of it all, working the room with the controlled ease of a man who had done this many times and derived zero pleasure from it. Amara saw him twice in the first hour. Both times from a distance. Both times his attention was elsewhere, or appeared to be. She was working the eastern corridor with a tray of empty glasses when she heard it. Not raised voices, something more deliberate than raised voices. She rounded the corner into the smaller anteroom off the main hall and found one of the catering girls, 19 at most, backed against the wall beside a tall window, her tray on the floor at her feet where it had been knocked or placed, and 2 men in front of her who had arranged themselves in the specific geometry that needed no verbal explanation. Amara set her tray on the nearest flat surface. "Excuse me," she said, clearly, without apology. The men turned. They were the kind of men who expected interruptions to apologize for themselves. One of them looked her over the way some men look at women, beginning at the feet and ending at the face as though the face were the least important part. His expression said several things, none of them worth repeating. "This doesn't involve you," he said. "She's part of my staff rotation. I need her in the kitchen." Amar looked directly at the girl. "Now please." The girl's eyes went to the men, then to Amara, then made the calculation quickly and came away from the wall. The taller man stepped sideways, partially blocking. "I said this doesn't involve you." Slower this time. Waited with the specific confidence of a person who had never been told by someone like Amara that they were wrong about something. "And I heard you?" She met his eyes without blinking. "Move." The silence that followed had an edge to it. What ended it was not her. It was the sensation of a third presence in the room, and both men registered it in their bodies before anyone spoke, a slight shift in posture, a recalibration. She didn't look away from the man in front of her, but she felt the temperature in the room change the way Priya had described it. Dense, directed. "Is there a problem?" Damien Ashcroft said it without a question mark. The tall man turned. Whatever he saw in Damien's face replaced his previous expression with something more manageable. "No problem. Just a misunderstanding." "Good. Damien's voice was the same flat, controlled compression it always was. Then I won't keep you from the event. They left, not quickly enough to look like fleeing, but not slowly enough to look comfortable either. The girl from catering was shaking. Amara picked up the tray from the floor and placed it in her hands to give them something to do. Go to the kitchen, she said quietly. Tell Jean you need 5 minutes. She'll know what that means. The girl nodded and went. Amara straightened up and found Damien still in the room. He was watching her with that specific attentiveness that she was becoming, against every sensible part of her judgment, familiar with. You should have come to get me immediately, he said. There wasn't time. There is always time to avoid unnecessary exposure. With respect, sir, there wasn't. She picked up her own tray. They would have been done by the time I found you. A pause. You didn't flinch. I wasn't going to let that continue. He looked at her for a moment longer than the conversation required. Who taught you to hold ground like that? She thought about Raymond Brooks, who had been a quiet man but who had raised her in a specific tradition. You don't shrink for people who haven't earned your fear. That was it. That was the whole lesson. My father, she said. Something moved across Damien's face, there and then reorganized back into composure. The guests in question will not be invited back. Their relationship with this house is over. Thank you. Don't thank me. Everyone in this building is under my protection. That includes you. He said it without softness, not as comfort, as fact. That has always been the case, whether you knew it or not. He walked back toward the ballroom. She stood in the empty anteroom with the noise of 200 people muffled through the walls and thought about what that sentence actually meant when a man like Damien Ashcroft said it. Whether you knew it or not. The weeks after the gala were different. Not dramatically, not in ways she could have pointed to cleanly if asked. But the geometry of the estate shifted in small ways that she noticed because she was the kind of person who noticed small things. Better food appeared at the staff table, and while Mrs. Holloway said nothing about it, Jean winked at Amara over the serving dishes in a way that was as good as a spoken sentence. The security camera at the end of the East Wing corridor, which had been positioned toward the staircase for as long as Amara had been on staff, was adjusted to cover the entire hallway length, including her door. She noticed it on a Tuesday morning and stood looking at it for a long time before she continued to work. Priya noticed the camera too. She said nothing about it in words, only looked at it, and then looked at Amara, with an expression that wasn't quite a smile, that was more complex than a smile. Something between recognition and the particular sadness that comes with recognizing something you can't easily resolve. Amara started finding reasons to be in rooms she knew he passed through. She was honest enough with herself to acknowledge this, even if she would have been unable to explain it to anyone else. It wasn't romantic, she told herself. It was more animal than that, more specific. She wanted to understand what she had started to see beneath the controlled surface. Not out of romantic fantasy, but out of the same instinct that made her read broken crystal for its fracture patterns. Things that held themselves this rigidly had broken at some point. She wanted to know where. He found her in the library again on a Thursday evening in early December, when the grounds were frozen and the daylight had collapsed before 4. She was at the reading table with one of the estate's older volumes open in front of her, a history of the region's architecture that she had pulled out of simple curiosity and then found genuinely absorbing. She didn't hear him in the doorway until he spoke. "You read," he said. She looked up. "Is that surprising?" He came into the room rather than standing in the doorway, which she had noticed was itself significant. He didn't come into spaces casually. Every movement was chosen. "I wasn't sure the library was accessible to staff. It wasn't listed in the restricted areas." "No," he said. It wasn't. He stopped at the far end of the table, picked up a book that was lying there, and looked at the cover without opening it. Put it back down. He was doing that thing she had started to recognize where he occupied the same space as her without quite knowing how to proceed in it, a hesitation so small and so well controlled that anyone less attentive would have missed it entirely. She decided to speak because she was tired of not speaking. "The crane," she said. "You moved it to your desk." "Yes." "You positioned it toward the light." "Yes." "Can I ask you something about your father?" The room went quiet in a specific way. Not hostile, guarded. "You can ask," he said. The things he left you. Is the crane the only one? He looked at her, full attention, unguarded for a moment, which on his face was the equivalent of someone else throwing open a window. No, he said. There are others. In the West Wing. It was the first time he had voluntarily mentioned the West Wing to her. She recognized it as exactly what it was. Something offered, small, possibly costly. Are they things he made? She asked. Things he collected. Things he repaired, some of them. A pause. He had a similar instinct to yours, apparently. He believed broken things deserved better than disposal. The sentence hung in the warm, lamplit air between them. He sounds like someone worth knowing, Amara said. He was. Flat delivery. No self-pity, no performance. Just the specific gravity of a true thing said plainly. He died making a mistake he shouldn't have had to make alone. He stopped himself, reset. That's enough on that. Okay, she said. She didn't push. She had learned from her grandmother that some repairs you begin and step back from, and let the material tell you when it's ready for the next stage. He stayed in the library for another 12 minutes, not speaking again, but not leaving either, moving slowly between the shelves with his hands behind his back, the way she had seen him move through the grounds at dusk, conducting that internal argument with himself. She read, or she held the book open. The distinction felt less clear than it should have. When he left, he said goodnight. It was the first time he had done that. She sat with the book closed on the table in front of her for a while after, pressing her palms flat against the cover and making herself breathe at a normal rate. She was in trouble. She knew exactly what kind. She knew all the reasons it was impossible, starting with the fundamental and architectural ones, and moving through the professional and the personal, and ending somewhere in the territory of basic self-preservation. She was a housekeeper in this man's house. He was a man whose West Wing she was forbidden to enter, and behind whose door someone had spoken in the voice of controlled fear. She was a woman who needed this salary to keep her family afloat, who could not afford the specific disruption that this particular feeling represented. She knew all of it. It helped with nothing. The surveillance cameras she discovered on a Sunday in the second week of December were not only in the corridors. She found the first one by accident, a small device set into the upper corner of the east sitting room, positioned carefully behind the cornice so that it was invisible from below unless you were standing on a ladder cleaning the crown molding, which she was. She stopped moving, looked at it directly. It was a good piece of equipment, small and well-maintained, the kind that wasn't available at consumer price points. She found 3 more that afternoon, systematically, without touching any of them. That evening, she knocked on the door of Mrs. Holloway's office. The sitting rooms, she said when Mrs. Holloway opened. There are cameras. Yes, Mrs. Holloway said. In the staff areas too? A pause. No, but throughout the ground floor. Throughout the estate. Yes. She studied Amara's face. Does that disturb you? Amara thought about it honestly. I want to understand why. That, Mrs. Holloway said, is a conversation for Mr. Ashcroft. She didn't go to him directly. She waited because she was not by nature an impulsive woman, and because she understood that demanding answers from powerful people was a different discipline than asking for them, and the timing mattered as much as the question. He came to her instead. 4 days later, in the corridor outside the library near the end of the afternoon. Mrs. Holloway tells me you found the equipment, he said. I wasn't looking for it. I know. I watched you find it. He let that sit for exactly 1 second, and I watched you leave it completely alone. Touching it seemed like a fast way to make a difficult situation worse. Correct. He looked at her steadily. Do you want to know why they're there? Yes. This house contains information, he said. Documents, records, materials of a kind that certain people would pay significant sums to access. The security system is comprehensive because the alternative is catastrophic. He paused. That's the accurate answer and the incomplete one. She waited. The complete answer, he said, and she could see something in him that looked like effort, like a man picking up something heavier than he had expected, is that I do not tolerate uncertainty about what happens in my own house. I need to know. That has always been the case. He met her eyes. You have never once been invisible to me, Miss Brooks. Not since the first day you arrived. The silence that followed was the loudest thing she had heard since she came to this estate. And then, from the direction of the west wing, something moved. Not a door, not footsteps. Something in the air of the corridor, a change in pressure or attention that both of them registered at the same moment, because she saw it cross his face a fraction of a second before she felt it herself. His eyes moved past her shoulder, sharp and fast, and the expression that replaced the careful openness of the last 60 seconds was something else entirely. Controlled, threat-ready. A man who had been caught in an unguarded moment, returning to the face he wore when the world was watching. He said her name once, quietly. "Miss Brooks?" "Yes." "Go back to your room, now. Don't use the main corridor." She didn't argue. She turned and walked, not running because running would be wrong, and she made it to the east wing staircase in under a minute and climbed it quickly and stood behind her door with one hand flat on the wood, listening to the sound of her own breathing and the distant sound below. Of a door she was never meant to open. Being opened by someone who had a key she didn't know existed, and she understood, standing there in the dark with her pulse in her throat, that whatever Damien Ashcroft had been protecting her from had just walked through his front door wearing the face of someone he trusted. She stayed behind that door for 47 minutes. She knew the number because she counted. Not deliberately, not in the organized way she counted money or calculated debt, but in the involuntary way the mind reaches for structure when the body is telling it that something is wrong and the body is not mistaken. 1 Mississippi, 2 Mississippi, the way her brother Marcus used to count during thunderstorms when he was small, and she would sit beside him on the bed and tell him to count until the fear had somewhere to go. She counted. The house made sounds below her, not loud sounds. That was the thing that kept her feet planted on the cold floor instead of moving toward the stairs. Loud sounds she could have categorized. These were the other kind. Controlled. Deliberate. The sounds of people moving through a space with great care not to be heard, which was somehow more frightening than anything that would have come with volume. At 47 minutes, the sound stopped. She waited another 10 before she moved. The corridor below was empty. The main hall was empty. Through the narrow window at the base of the east staircase, she could see the driveway, and on the driveway, in the deep shadow beyond the reach of the exterior lights, the rear end of a car she didn't recognize. Dark, long, already moving, pulling away from the estate through the iron gates before she could fix any identifying detail in her memory. She stood at that window until the taillights disappeared and the night closed back over the driveway like water over a stone. In the morning, nothing was different. That was almost worse than if something had been. Mrs. Holloway ran the breakfast service with her usual precision. Tobias was visible through the kitchen window, crossing the frost-covered grounds with a wheelbarrow. Jean made eggs and did not wink at anyone. Priya ate with her eyes on her plate and her shoulders slightly higher than their usual position, which Amara noted and filed. Damien did not appear for breakfast. He rarely did. But on this particular morning, his absence had a different texture, like the difference between a room that is empty because no one is there and a room that is empty because something has just left it. She went about her rotation. She cleaned. She moved through the rooms of the estate with her hands in her eyes and let her mind run below the surface of the work, which was the only way she knew how to think through things that didn't resolve cleanly. What she knew, someone had come into the estate through a door connected to the west wing. Damien had known they were coming, or known something was coming, because his face had shifted from open to armored in the fraction of a second before she registered the change in pressure herself. He had sent her away specifically, with a specific route, which meant he knew or suspected the main corridor was compromised. The car had left before midnight. What she didn't know, everything else. She found Priya in the laundry room at 10:30, alone, running sheets through the press with the mechanical focus of someone keeping their hands busy so their brain had an excuse not to. "Last night," Amara said. Priya didn't look up. "I didn't see anything last night." "Priya." The younger woman's hand stopped on the sheet. She turned around. Her face was composed in the careful way that told Amara the composure was load-bearing. "There are things that happen in this house," Priya said slowly, "that have nothing to do with us. That have never had anything to do with us. And the way you stay employed here, and the way you stay," she paused on the next word, chose it carefully, "safe, is by understanding that that separation is real and maintaining it." Someone came into the house. "People come into this house all the time. It's a working estate." At that hour, through that door. Priya looked at her for a long moment. Then she turned back to the press. "I've been here 6 months," she said quietly. "I have a sister in Manchester who is dependent on my income. I have a visa situation that is not entirely simple." She pressed the sheet without looking up. "I am telling you this not to make you feel sorry for me, but so you understand why I'm going to finish this laundry and not continue this conversation." Amara left her there. The conversation with Damien happened that afternoon, not because she engineered it, but because he appeared in the East Corridor at a time when she was the only staff member in that part of the house, and he clearly knew she would be, which told her something about the cameras and about attention and about the weeks of observation that had been running beneath the surface of both their days. He looked different. Not in any way she could have described specifically to someone who didn't know his face. But she knew it now in the way you know the face of a person you have watched carefully in multiple kinds of light, and what she saw was the residue of a night that had taken something out of him. "Walk with me," he said. They went to the library. He closed the door, which he had never done before, and stood at the window with his back to the room, in that posture she had come to recognize as the one he adopted when he was deciding how much of a true thing to say. She waited. "The man who came last night," he said, "is someone I have known for 11 years. She said nothing. "He came to deliver information that he believed I needed to have in person, off record." He turned from the window. "I'm telling you this because you were present and because I told you to leave without explanation and because you deserve better than silence after the fact." "What was the information?" "That someone inside this estate has been sharing information with people who would like very much to see my operation compromised." He watched her face. "I don't mean financially compromised." The weight of the sentence settled. "How long?" she asked. "Months, possibly longer." "Do you know who?" "I have suspicions." His jaw moved slightly, a small tightening. Confirmation takes longer than suspicion. She thought about Priya with her hands on the sheet press, and her sister in Manchester, and her complicated visa. She thought about Tobias with his 3-word sentences and 4 years of silence. She thought about Mrs. Holloway and the silver hair and the assessments delivered in 2-second windows that missed nothing. "Are you going to tell me what you suspect?" she asked. "No." "Then why are you telling me anything?" He was quiet for a moment. The fire in the corner of the library had been lit that morning and was burning down to steady coals. The light it threw was the amber kind that makes everything in a room look like it belongs to a different time. "Because 3 weeks ago I placed a camera in the East Corridor outside your room," he said. "And I think you deserve to know that that decision was not professional in nature." The silence after that was extraordinary. She felt her pulse in places she didn't usually feel it, in her wrists, behind her eyes. She stood very still, the way she stood when she was holding something fragile. "Not professional," she repeated. "No. What was it?" He looked at her with the particular directness that she had decided weeks ago was the most unnerving thing about him. Not because it was aggressive, but because it was simply honest. And she wasn't used to that kind of honesty from powerful men in positions of structural authority over her. "I don't have a clean answer to that," he said. "I'm aware that I don't. I'm aware of every reason why this conversation is inappropriate and what it implies about decisions I have made in the last several weeks that were not objective." He paused. "I'm also aware that honesty, even when it is uncomfortable, is the only currency I have left that I consider real." She sat down in the chair at the reading table, not because she needed to, but because it moved her out of the space of standing across from him in a way that felt like confrontation and into something else. "Tell me about your father," she said. He blinked. A single full blink, which on his face was the equivalent of someone visibly startled. "That is not what I expected you to say." "I know. Tell me anyway." He sat down across from her, not immediately, but after a pause in which she could see him deciding whether to do it. When he sat, the formality changed, not disappeared. Changed. Like a coat not taken off but loosened slightly. "My father built this empire," he said. "Not legitimately. He knew what he was building, and he chose it because the alternative, when he began, was poverty and everything that comes with poverty in the specific circumstances he came from." A pause. "He was not a violent man by nature. He became one by necessity, and he never stopped hating himself for it, which is a terrible combination. And he left it to you. He left me no choice. I was 22 when he died. The infrastructure was already in place. the alliances, the obligations, the things that go wrong if no one maintains them. His hands rested on the table in front of him. I spent 15 years telling myself I was managing what already existed, that I was different from him. A short sound, not quite a laugh. I was not different from him. I made different specific choices and the same fundamental one, which was to protect the structure instead of dismantling it. She looked at his hands, steady on the table, no ring, no watch, just the hands themselves, which were the hands of a person who had done physical things at some point in a life that was now entirely conducted at the level of command and consequence. "Why are you telling me this?" she asked. "Because you asked about my father." He looked at her. "And because you are the first person who has asked me about him in 11 years who wanted an honest answer rather than a useful one." The afternoon light had moved across the library floor while they talked, shifting as it did in December, going amber to bronze to the gray edge of early dark. She was aware of time passing in the way she was aware of it in moments that she understood, even while inside them she would think about later. She was aware of something else. The thing she had been telling herself for weeks was professional interest or natural curiosity, or the ordinary human response to proximity and partial revelation, the thing she had cataloged and managed with the same discipline she applied to everything else that threatened to become more than she could afford. She was running out of the ability to call it something else. "Damien," she said, his name, first time. He went very still. "I understand all the reasons why this—" She stopped, started again. "I know what I am in this house. I know what you are. I know the distance between those two things and what it means." She pressed her palms flat on the table, her grandmother's gesture, grounding before a difficult thing. "And I'm telling you that none of that is sufficient reason for me to pretend I don't see what I see when I look at you." The fire popped once in the corner. Outside, wind moved through the frozen grounds. "What do you see?" he asked. Quiet, direct. "Someone who has been alone for a very long time," she said, "and who has made peace with it by calling it discipline." The word landed somewhere in him. She watched it arrive. He reached across the table, slowly, with the care of someone performing an action they are not certain they have the right to perform, and his hand covered hers on the table. That was all. He didn't move closer. He didn't say anything. He just placed his hand over hers and held it there, and it was the most unguarded thing she had seen him do in 7 weeks, and it cost him something. She could see it in the set of his shoulders and the steadiness with which he held her gaze, as though steadiness were the only way to keep this real. They stayed like that for a moment that had no clean edges. Then the door opened. Not Mrs. Holloway, not Priya, not any member of the household staff. The man who stepped into the library was someone she had seen before, once, briefly, in passing near the main staircase during her first week. She had registered him then as a visitor or contractor, someone whose presence had a temporary quality. She had not seen him since, and had not thought to wonder about it. He was perhaps 50. Well-built. The kind of face that inspired institutional confidence, that said former military or senior law enforcement in the carriage of the head and the economy of physical expression. He had the estate security identification clipped to his jacket, and he wore it with the ease of someone who had been wearing it for long enough that it had stopped being a deliberate act. He saw their hands on the table. His face produced a brief expression, quickly organized back into professional neutrality, and he looked at Damien. "Apologies for the interruption, sir. There's a matter in the security office requiring your immediate attention." Damien withdrew his hand. Not quickly, but he withdrew it. "Give me a moment." "It's urgent, sir." Damien looked at Amara. Something moved between them in the look, something that didn't need words to carry meaning, and she nodded slightly, a fraction of movement, and he stood. "I'll find you later," he said to her. He left with the man. The library door closed. Amara sat at the table for a while. Then she got up and went about the rest of her day with the specific discipline of a woman who has learned to contain large things in small spaces and continue functioning around them. He did not find her that evening, or the following morning. By the second day, she was aware of an absence that was different from his ordinary privacy. The household felt it too. Mrs. Holloway was more clipped than usual. Jean cooked without speaking. Tobias appeared twice inside the house, which he almost never did, ostensibly for maintenance reasons, moving through the corridors with the slow patience of someone keeping an eye on a developing situation. On the afternoon of the second day, Amara was called to the security office. The room was in the East Wing basement, a part of the estate she had been to only once during the initial tour. She went because the message came through Mrs. Holloway and was phrased as a request, though everyone in the house understood that requests of this type were not optional. The man who had opened the library door was waiting inside. He introduced himself as Mr. Crail. Head of estate security, he said, though she realized she had never been formally introduced to him during her time on staff, which was itself something she should have noticed earlier and hadn't. He offered her a seat with the courtesy of someone who had conducted this kind of meeting many times before and knew that courtesy was often more disarming than its alternatives. She sat. She kept her hands in her lap and her face where she wanted it. "Miss Brooks," he began, "I want to be direct with you because I think you'll appreciate that more than the alternative. All right? You've been here approximately 7 weeks. In that time, you have had an unusual degree of contact with Mr. Ashcroft relative to other staff members." He paused. "I'd like to understand the nature of that contact. I'm not sure what you mean by unusual. Private conversations, extended time in shared spaces, access that other staff members at your level don't typically have." His tone was even, professional, the way a blade is professional. "I want to understand how that developed." "I repaired something that mattered to him," she said. "We spoke about it. We spoke again afterward. That's the sequence." "Did he discuss the nature of his business with you?" "No." "His associates? Upcoming events? Security arrangements?" "No." "Did he show you any documents, any materials related to operations or financial structures?" "No." She held his gaze without effort. "I clean this house, Mr. Crail. I don't involve myself in things that aren't my concern." He looked at her for a moment with eyes that were doing significant work behind a composed surface. "You're very calm," he said. "I don't have a reason to be otherwise." "Most people find this kind of conversation stressful. Most people haven't had the kind of life that makes this kind of conversation particularly distinctive," she said. Something moved in his expression. Brief. She would think about that later, about exactly what it was and what it indicated about the question she should have asked herself in that moment and did not. "I appreciate your cooperation," he said, standing. "That's all I needed." She stood as well. "Is Mr. Ashcroft all right?" A pause before the answer came. "Of course. Why do you ask?" "He's been unavailable for 2 days. He's occupied with business matters. Nothing unusual." He held the door. "Thank you for your time, Miss Brooks." She walked back through the East Wing basement corridor and climbed the stairs to the ground floor and stood in the kitchen doorway for a moment until Jean looked up from the stove. "Where is he?" Amara asked. Jean set down her spoon, looked at the doorway behind Amara, looked back at her. "He is in the West Wing," Jean said, quietly and precisely. "He has been there since yesterday morning. He has had no food brought to him, which he does sometimes, and he had 2 medical personnel arrive this morning by the back entrance, which he does not sometimes." She picked her spoon back up. "That is everything I know." Medical personnel. Amara moved. She was at the West Wing door in under 2 minutes, not running, not walking either, moving at the pace her body chose when her mind had already decided and her legs were following the decision. She raised her hand to knock. The door opened before her knuckles reached it. Damien stood in the doorway. His jacket was gone. The sleeves of his shirt were pushed to the elbows, and on his left forearm there was a bandage, white and clean, but covering something significant based on the thickness of it. His face was the exhausted face of a person who had been awake for 30 hours at minimum. He looked at her. Then he opened the door wider and stepped back. She walked through. The West Wing was not what she had imagined, not a vault, not a control room, a long corridor with 3 rooms off it, one of which appeared to be a private office, one a records room, and one, the furthest, a sitting room where 2 chairs faced each other across a low table and where the walls were lined not with security equipment, but with objects, small and carefully placed, the same kind of objects she had seen in the rest of the house, but more numerous and more personal. His father's collection. She understood it immediately. "What happened to your arm?" she asked. He looked at it as though he had momentarily forgotten. "A complication." "From what?" "From trusting the wrong person's judgment, including my own." She crossed the room and stood in front of him and looked at his face directly. The exhaustion, the held-together quality of a structure that has absorbed significant impact and is currently maintaining form through effort rather than integrity. "Tell me," she said. He sat down. She sat across from him. The low table between them held a glass of water that had gone warm, and a phone face down, and a small frame photograph she didn't look at directly, because that felt like too much access without permission. He told her. Not everything, but enough. The information that had come through his contact 2 nights ago named a source inside the estate, someone who had been systematically identifying his vulnerabilities and communicating them to the rival syndicate for the better part of 4 months. The attack on his arm had happened during a meeting that morning that had been intended to be confidential, that could only have been compromised by someone who knew the time, the location, and the participants, someone inside the estate. "Do you know who?" Amar asked. He picked up the phone, placed it face up between them. On the screen was a photograph, surveillance quality, time-stamped, taken in the East Wing basement corridor. In it, Krail stood at the door of the security office with a phone to his ear. The phone was not the estate-issue device that Amara had seen clipped to his belt on her first day. It was a personal phone, a second phone. She looked at the photograph for a long time. "He interviewed me this afternoon," she said. Damien's eyes sharpened. "What did he ask you?" "Whether you had shared information with me about operations, associates, documents." She paused. "Whether you had shown me anything." The expression on his face went through something fast and cold. He was assessing how much you knew, whether you were a liability. He stood up. "Amara, listen to me carefully." She looked up at him. "Krail has been in this house for 8 months. He has access to every security system, every camera feed, every entry and exit point. He knows the staff rotation. He knows your schedule." He stopped. The next sentence came out level and precise and absolutely without ambiguity. "He knows what you are to me. I made that visible, and I should not have, and that was my error, and I have to live with it, but right now the consequence of that error is not falling on me." The room was very quiet. She understood what he was saying. She understood it fully and completely in the way you understand things that are both true and terrible, things your body processes half a second before your mind catches up. "He was going to move against you," she said. "He already has." "Against me specifically. You are the fastest way to move against me specifically." His voice remained level, but it was the kind of level that requires enormous, continuous effort to maintain. Which is information I did not have until 40 minutes ago when his handler made contact with my network to communicate the terms of what they are proposing. Which are that I withdraw from 3 specific markets and dissolve 2 financial structures by end of month. In exchange, everyone inside this estate remains unharmed. She stood up. "That's a threat," she said. "Yes." "Against the staff. Against you." He said it plainly. "By name. Your name specifically appeared in the communication." He moved toward her, stopped himself at a distance that was respectful and clearly cost him something to maintain. "I am going to remove you from this estate tonight. I have a property outside Edinburgh, secure, staff I trust completely. You will go there tonight, and you will stay there until this is resolved." Amara looked at him, at the bandage on his arm and the 30 hours of sleeplessness on his face, and the controlled fear underneath all of it. The same fear she had heard in the voice behind the door on that first night. The fear of a person who has identified the thing they cannot afford to lose and is watching it become exactly the leverage their enemies need. "No," she said. He stared at her. "I'm not leaving," she said. "Running doesn't fix this. It just confirms to whoever sent that communication that you can be moved by threatening me, which means the next threat will be worse." She held his gaze. "I'm not a piece on a board that gets moved off when the game gets dangerous. I'm a person who is standing in front of you and telling you that the answer is not to hide me." The silence was enormous. "You don't understand what these people are capable of," he said. "No," she said. "But I understand what fear as a strategy produces. I have watched it my whole life, in my neighborhood, in my family, in every situation where the powerful person decided that the way to protect someone was to remove them from the equation." She took a breath. "It never works. It just teaches the threat to follow." He looked at her for a long time. The fire in the corner of this room was smaller than the one in the library, but it was burning steadily. Then tell me what you propose, he said. And she did. And it was the moment, though neither of them named it as such, when she stopped being a housekeeper in his house and became something. She told him 3 things. The first was that Creel's value to his enemies was entirely dependent on his continued presence inside the estate, which meant removing him openly would trigger whatever contingency plan the syndicate had prepared. And that contingency was almost certainly designed to activate the moment Creel went dark. The second was that the communication his network had received naming her specifically was not a threat in the ordinary sense, but a test, designed to measure how fast Damien moved and in which direction, and that any movement on his part tonight would be read and interpreted and used. The third was that the only leverage they currently held was the fact that Creel did not yet know his cover was broken. Damien listened to all 3 without interrupting. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment that felt longer than it was. "You worked this out when?" he said, "while I was walking up from the security office." He looked at her with an expression she hadn't seen on him before, not the controlled attention she knew, something rawer than that. "All right," he said. They worked through the night, not together in the same room, because that would register on the camera feeds that Creel still controlled, but in a coordinated silence that moved through the estate in the form of small instructions passed through Jean, who turned out to have a history she had not volunteered, and a set of competencies that explained why Damien's father had employed her 23 years ago, and why Damien had kept her without question. Amara ran her normal morning rotation the following day. Every room, every surface, every corridor precisely on schedule. She smiled at Creel when she passed him in the entrance hall. He smiled back. His smile was the practiced kind, the kind that lived on the surface of the face and did nothing below it, and she thought about that smile for the rest of the morning with a cold clarity that surprised her with its edges. The gala. That was what Damien had proposed. The corporation's annual charity event, which had been scheduled for the following Saturday and which could not be postponed without significant external consequence. 200 guests. Live press. A public venue that Creel's employers would read as an opportunity. A soft target surrounded by civilians. A place where Damien would be visible and exposed, and where the stakes of any incident would be amplified by the presence of cameras and witnesses. They would read it as opportunity. Damien intended it as a closing trap. The days between were the hardest of Amar's life, harder in some ways than the weeks after her father's death, because grief at least is honest about what it is. This was grief with a performance layered on top of it. She cleaned. She ate at the staff table. She slept in intervals of 2 and 3 hours and woke each time with the specific clarity of someone whose nervous system has decided that sleep is a liability. She spoke to her mother on Sunday and said everything was fine in a voice that was steady and true and entirely hollow. Priya knew something was happening. Amara saw it in the way the younger woman moved around her, closer than before but quieter, with the instinct of someone who understands that a person carrying something large needs space held open around them, not filled with questions. On Wednesday, Creel passed her in the East Corridor and stopped. "Miss Brooks, how are you settling in?" "Well, thank you. The work suiting you?" "It is." He studied her face with those professional eyes that were very good at their job. "Mr. Ashcroft seems comfortable with your presence, more than with previous staff." "I couldn't speak to that." "He mentioned you to me," Creel said, casually. The casual of a man who is never casual. "Spoke well of you. He doesn't do that often." She held his gaze and felt her pulse doing something loud and urgent in her chest and showed him none of it. "That's kind of him," she said. "Yes." He nodded once, the movement of a period at the end of a sentence. "Well, enjoy the rest of your day." She waited until he rounded the corner before she let out the breath she had been holding since he stopped walking. It came out slow and controlled because she had learned in the last 4 days that control was not a luxury. It was survival equipment. She found Jean in this kitchen at 4:30 and stood at the counter beside her under the pretext of collecting the staff afternoon tea, and said quietly, without looking at her, "He tested me today." Jean poured from the pot without changing her expression. "What did he use?" "Damien's name. Said he mentioned me to him, trying to establish whether Damien had told me about the plan." "And you gave him?" "Nothing. Jean put the pot down and looked at her for a moment with the unhurried assessment of a woman who has seen many situations and learned to read the ones that matter. "You'll do," she said, and returned to the stove. The gala setup began Friday morning. External catering staff arrived, the same company as the previous event, vetted and cleared, moving through the ballroom and service corridors with the efficient anonymity of people who do this kind of work at this kind of level and know how to be invisible in expensive spaces. Floral arrangements, tables, audio equipment, the transformation of the ballroom from the estate's largest formal room into something designed to communicate wealth applied for good purposes, which was the specific fiction that events of this kind existed to perform. Amara worked the eastern and northern rooms during the setup, staying out of the ballroom, following her rotation with mechanical precision. She was in the Upper East Corridor at 2 in the afternoon when Damien appeared at the far end and walked toward her at the pace of a man crossing his own house, which he was, and which meant nothing to any camera that might be watching. He stopped beside her at the linen closet, ostensibly examining something on the corridor wall. "Tonight," he said, barely above conversational volume. "His contact arrives at 10. We have a 17-minute window from the moment they connect." 17. "My team moves on the perimeter at the same moment. Internal resolution is mine." A pause. "Yours is to be in the east wing and stay there. The security door at the base of the east staircase has been coded to your palm print as of this morning. If anything moves that isn't on the approved staff list, that door locks and you are behind it. And if the 17 minutes extends, it won't." Damien. He looked at her, close enough that she could see the controlled alertness in him, every system running at capacity, the man who had been built by circumstances into something formidable, now fully inhabiting that shape for a purpose he believed in. "If it extends," he said, "you stay behind the door. That is not negotiable." "All right." He moved to go. "Damien." His name again, still costing her something to say it in this particular register. "Be careful." He looked at her one more moment. "I'll see you on the other side of it," he said, and walked away. She didn't sleep Friday night. She lay on her bed with her eyes on the ceiling and ran through every possible failure point in what they had constructed and found approximately 14 of them, and spent the hours until dawn deciding which ones were acceptable risk and which ones required mitigation. She didn't currently have the resources to provide. By 5 in the morning, she had reduced the list to 6. By 6, she was out of bed and dressed and in the kitchen before Jean arrived. Jean found her at this counter with 2 cups of coffee already made and sat down across from her without comment and drank one. "You know what I did before this house?" Jean said. "No. I was a logistics coordinator for an organization that moved things across borders that most organizations preferred not to think about." She set her cup down. "I worked for Damien's father for 3 years before I came here. When his father died, Damien asked me to stay. He was 22 years old and he had just inherited something enormous. And he said to me, 'Jean, I don't know how to do this, and I need people who are honest about what they know and what they don't.'" She looked at Amara steadily. "I have been in this house for 15 years. I have seen 6 people betray him. I have seen 4 people try to remove him from the equation permanently." She paused. "He is still here. The people who tried are not." Amara wrapped her hands around her cup. "Why are you telling me this?" "Because tonight you're going to want to stay behind that door, and you're also going to want not to. And I want you to understand that the instinct to go through it is an instinct worth having." She stood. "I'm going to make breakfast now." The gala began at 7. 200 people filled the ballroom by 8, the specific mixture that events like this produced: legitimate business, charitable performance, old money maintaining its visibility, and underneath all of it, woven in at specific intervals, the other kind. The kind that came because the host was a man whose network touched things that legitimate business preferred to access through intermediary arrangements and appropriate distance. Amara wore the staff uniform she had been wearing for 7 weeks and moved through the service corridors with trays and removed glassware and did the invisible work of the invisible people who make the visible world function. She watched. That was the other thing she did. She watched the room with the attention she had developed over 7 weeks of living inside a house that rewarded attentiveness and punished its absence. She saw Krail at 8:45, positioned near the ballroom's northern exit, his staff identification visible on his lapel, talking to no one and watching everything. His body language was the language of a man waiting for a specific time. She clocked his position and continued moving. She saw Damien at 9, working the room in the way she had seen him work it before at the previous event, the controlled ease that was not ease but discipline, performing ease for an audience that needed to believe in it. He was speaking to a woman in a blue gown and a man whose name Amara didn't know, and his eyes did not find hers across the room, which was the right choice and which cost her something to witness. At 9:37, she was in the northern service corridor returning a tray to the kitchen station when the lights in the corridor flickered. A single flicker, half a second, the kind that the public rooms would have absorbed without anyone noticing because the public rooms were on a different circuit. The service corridor was not on that circuit. She set the tray down. The flicker meant the East Wing security feed had experienced an interruption, which was not on the schedule, which meant either the plan had moved early or something had gone wrong with the plan or something outside the plan had started. She moved toward the East Corridor access door, which was her designated position, which was where she was supposed to be. She was 15 feet from it when the explosion happened, not in the ballroom. In the northern service wing, somewhere above her, the second floor, a sound that wasn't enormous but was specific. The kind of sound that has direction and consequence and is not an accident, followed immediately by the smell of something electrical burning, and then by the sound of people in the ballroom beginning to respond to something they didn't understand. Then a second sound, closer, ground level. The northern exterior door. It came open. The men who came through it were 4 in number, dressed in the generic dark clothing of people who intend to be invisible in the chaos that follows a specific kind of deliberate disruption. They moved with the coordinated purpose of people who have rehearsed this. The first man held a device she recognized from the shape as a signal jammer. The second and third held weapons. The fourth carried nothing visible, which meant he was management. Amara was inside the service corridor and they had not yet cleared the entrance. She had approximately 6 seconds. She used 3 of them to get into the kitchen staging area and 2 more to get behind the stainless steel preparation counter, and 1 to decide that staying down was the right choice, and that moving toward the East Corridor door would require crossing the open corridor space, and that the math on that was wrong. She heard them come through the service corridor, 4 sets of footsteps, organized, sweeping the space. The kitchen staging area had 2 entry points, and she was between them, which was either very good or catastrophic, depending on the next 30 seconds. The footsteps passed the first entry, paused, continued. Her heart was doing something that she could actually feel against her sternum, a hard, insistent hammering that she was certain was audible in the silence between her controlled breathing and the distant commotion of 200 people in a ballroom being told by event staff that there was a minor electrical issue and everything was under control. A voice, close. The management one. Service level clear. Moving to East access. They were going for the East Wing, going for the door that Damien had coded to her palm print. The door that controlled access to the section of the estate where the most critical security infrastructure lived. They needed her hand to open it, or they needed to bring it down by force, which would take longer and make noise, or they had a contingency she hadn't predicted, which was the option that made her stomach drop because it was the option she had no information about. She came up from behind the counter. She did it the way her body decided to do it, before the part of her brain that was still performing the risk calculation had finished performing it. She stood up straight, and she walked into the service corridor, and she said clearly and without performance, "The door won't open for you." The 4 men stopped moving. The management one turned around. He was younger than she had expected, mid-30s. The face of someone who had calculated the distance between here and success and found it acceptable. "Miss Brooks," he said, like he knew her, like this was the expected outcome of a conversation they had already been having. "You needed me to open it," she said. "That's why I'm not already in the East Wing. You couldn't get me there fast enough after the explosion without revealing your position, so you came to me instead." He looked at her for a moment. "You're very composed." "I've had a difficult few weeks. It builds up." "The door." He took a step toward her. "Open it." "No." "Miss Brooks?" "No." She held her ground on the service corridor floor in her staff uniform with the smell of something still burning overhead, and 200 people 40 feet away behind a door, and the hammering in her chest so loud she could feel it in her jaw. Whatever Krail told you about how this works, he was wrong. I'm not the way in. Then you're the way to make a phone call, he said, to a man who will open any door in this building to keep you standing. She had known this was where it was going. She had known it since Damien told her about the communication that named her. She had spent 4 days preparing her response to exactly this moment, turning it over and examining it from every angle the way she examined fracture patterns, looking for the place where the break was honest. She thought about Raymond Brooks in the last 2 years of his life, carrying things he shouldn't have had to carry alone. She thought about what her grandmother said about damaged things and disposal and what they deserved better than. She thought about Damien standing in this house for 15 years maintaining something that was already built, telling himself it was management and not choice. She thought about what she had said to him 3 days ago. Running doesn't fix this. She thought about 17 minutes. Then make the call, she said, and tell him I said to stay exactly where he is. The management man looked at her with something that was almost, not quite, respect. That's not how this works. It is tonight. She looked at the man directly. Because the alternative is that you bring this building down around your own exit route. You need the east wing door to get out with what you came for. I'm the only one who opens it, and I'm not opening it until this is over. A silence in the service corridor that had the quality of a held breath. Then, from somewhere above them, she heard footsteps. Fast. Multiple. Not the coordinated sweep pattern of the 4 men around her. Something else. Coming from the north staircase. The management man heard it too. She saw his attention shift by a fraction. That fraction was enough. The kitchen staging area door behind her opened and Jean came through it in the specific unhurried way that Jean did everything, and what Jean held in her right hand was a fire suppression canister from the kitchen wall mounting that was regulation equipment in any commercial kitchen, and was also, as it turned out, a viable option in other situations. She discharged it directly into the face of the nearest armed man. The noise and the chemical cloud occupied the corridor for the next 4 seconds. And in those 4 seconds, several things happened simultaneously. The management man moved toward Amara, and she stepped back into the doorframe behind her, and the doorframe was all the leverage she needed to deliver her elbow to the side of his head with the full weight of her body behind it, which was not an insignificant amount of weight, and which produced a very satisfying result. He hit the wall and went down and stayed there. The footsteps from the north staircase hit the ground floor. Damien came through the service corridor entrance at a run, which was the first time she had seen him move at anything above a controlled pace, and behind him, 2 men she didn't recognize, who moved with the specific efficiency of people whose entire professional skill set was applicable to this exact situation. He took in the corridor in one sweep. The canister. John, the management man on the floor. The other 3 in various states of chemical distress. Amara standing in the doorframe with her elbow already beginning to register what it had just done. His eyes found her face. She nodded once. He crossed the corridor in 6 steps, and then he stopped in front of her with his chest working harder than she had ever seen it, and his hands coming up to her face in a gesture so unguarded and immediate that it crossed every line they had been carefully maintaining for 7 weeks, and she didn't step back from it. "I told you to be behind the door," he said. His voice was completely wrecked. "I know." "Amara, they needed me to open it. I was more useful here." He looked at her with an expression that was too many things at once to name cleanly. She felt his hands against her face like they were the first warm thing she had touched since she walked through the iron gates of this estate, and she thought distantly that she would have to examine that later, what it meant that this was what warmth felt like in this particular chapter of her life. "Are you hurt?" he said. "My elbow." "Your elbow." "I hit someone with it." He made the sound again that wasn't quite a laugh. Behind him, his people were moving with professional efficiency through the service corridor. Through the ballroom door, she could hear voices, organized now. The sound of a situation being managed. Staff and security redirecting 200 people away from whatever the public story was going to be. "It's done?" she asked. "Krail is in custody. His contact on the perimeter is detained. The syndicate's financial structure—" He stopped himself. "Yes. It's done." "Your arm." He looked at the bandage, which had acquired a new stain in the last 20 minutes. "I'll live." "Damien." "I'll live." he said again, more firmly, like she needed the repetition. She put her hand over his on her face, felt the steadiness of it despite everything. Despite the arm and the 30-plus hours and the thing that had been dismantled tonight and would take months to fully understand the consequences of. "I need to sit down," she said honestly. He put his arm around her, the good one, and she didn't move away from it, and they stood in the service corridor of his estate with John behind them, calmly replacing the fire suppression canister on the wall bracket, and men in dark clothing moving with efficient purpose through the space around them. And the world outside the estate's iron gates going about its ordinary Friday evening business, entirely unaware that something irrevocable had just been decided inside these walls. The irrevocable thing was not the dismantling of the syndicate's operation. It was the fact that Amara Brooks had stood on the floor of that corridor with her hands empty and her chest hammering and said no to the thing that was supposed to make her fold, and she had not folded. And Damien Ashcroft had come through the door to find her still standing, and the expression on his face in that moment was something she would carry for the rest of her life. He had come through that door and looked at her, and she had seen, for one completely unguarded second, what she was to him. It was not a small thing. In the East Wing, in the room she had been sleeping in for 7 weeks with the window cracked for the sound of something alive outside. The crystal crane sat where she had left it on the narrow desk beside her bed. She had moved it there quietly 3 days ago, without explanation, closer to her, where she could see it in the morning light. The repaired wing caught the lamp glow and held it, and the place where it had broken and been made whole was, from this angle, in this light, the most beautiful part of the whole. Outside the estate's iron gates, at the end of the long driveway where the mercenary vehicles had been, blue lights were beginning to arrive. And in the West Wing, for the first time in Amara's memory, the door stood open. The blue lights were still turning outside when the first police vehicle came through the gates. Damien watched them from the West Wing window with his arm rebandaged and his jacket back on, and the particular stillness of a man who has been moving at full capacity for 72 hours and has just now, in this specific moment, been permitted to stop. Amara stood beside him, not close enough to touch, close enough that she could feel the heat coming off him, the residual intensity of a body that had been running on adrenaline and decision for 3 days and was only now beginning to process the cost. Outside, his people were managing the handoff with the efficiency of an operation that had been planned for exactly this outcome. Crail in restraints, cooperative in the way men become cooperative when the math of their situation has been fully explained to them. 3 of his associates detained at the perimeter. The 4th, the management man from the service corridor, sitting on the floor of the East Wing with a bruised temple and the resigned expression of someone who has had better Fridays. Amara's elbow had swollen. She had been ignoring it for the last 40 minutes because ignoring it was still an available option, and she intended to use it until it wasn't. "The authorities," she said. "You called them yourself?" "Yes." "Not just to clean up the perimeter?" "No." He turned from the window. Crail's operation involved financial fraud across 4 jurisdictions in addition to the rest of it. There are people who have jurisdiction over that who are not me. He paused. "I made a decision some time ago, before tonight, that the answer was not to handle everything inside my own walls, that some things should go to the people whose job it is to handle them." She looked at him. "Before tonight? When exactly?" He held her gaze. "About 3 weeks ago. In a library. During a conversation about a crystal crane. The silence between them was the kind that doesn't need to be filled. Outside, voices carried up from the drive, official and procedural, the machinery of consequence doing its work. "They'll want to speak to me," she said. "Yes, my legal team will be present for that. You will not speak to anyone tonight without them in the room. That is not negotiable, and it is not a reflection on you." "I know." "Your employment status," he began. "Damien." She said it quietly, but it stopped him. "We don't have to do that right now." He looked at her for a moment, then nodded once. He crossed the room and sat in one of the chairs that faced each other across the low table, the chairs she had sat in 4 days ago when he first brought her into this wing and told her the truth about Crail. He did not look like a man who had just dismantled a criminal operation. He looked like a man who was extremely tired and had not yet decided what to do with the silence that follows the end of an emergency. She sat across from him, same positions as before. The small framed photograph was still on the low table, and this time she looked at it directly because they were past the point where not looking was a reasonable form of courtesy. A man in his late 50s, gray at the temples, standing outside what was clearly this estate in a different season, summer, the grounds green behind him. His face had the shape of the face across from her now, the same jaw, the same density of expression, but something softer in the eyes. The specific softness of a man who had made his primary peace with himself. "Your father," she said, "taken about 2 years before he died." Damien looked at the photograph without the careful management he applied to most things. "He's standing outside because he always preferred to be outside. Said the house was magnificent, but it breathed wrong. Too much controlled air." A pause. "He was right." She looked at the photograph for another moment. "He looks like a man who laughed at himself." He did, constantly. It was his most reliable coping mechanism. Something in his voice, not quite grief, the thing that comes after grief when you've carried it long enough that it becomes part of the structure of you rather than an injury. "He would have liked you." "How do you know?" "Because you told me no 4 days ago, with the same expression he used when he was about to explain why something I was proposing was structurally unsound. He said it without humor, but with something that served the same function. He had a word for it. He said the most dangerous people in any room were the ones who weren't impressed." Amar thought about that. "He built something dangerous and left it to you." "Yes." "And you maintained it for 15 years. "Yes." "And tonight you handed part of it to the police." "Part of it. The part that belongs there." He leaned forward with his elbows on his knees, which was the most physically informal posture she had ever seen from him. "The rest of it, I intend to restructure, legitimately. It will take time, and it will cost a significant amount, and some of the alliances currently in place will not survive the transition." He looked at his hands. "I made that decision before tonight, but tonight made it easier to commit to. Because of Krail, and because of what Krail chose as the fastest route to my compliance." He looked up. "You were the fastest route. That told me something about the decisions I had been making that had created that particular vulnerability." She understood what he was saying and what he was not saying. The thing that was not being said occupied the space between them with considerable presence. "You're saying it's your fault that I was named," she said. "I'm saying my choices made you visible to people who should never have known you existed." His voice stayed even. It cost him something to keep it that way. "That is not an acceptable outcome. I need to be direct about that." "You're being direct about it right now." "I'm telling you, it won't happen again." "You can't promise that." "No," he said. "I can promise to build something different, something that doesn't generate that specific category of risk." He paused. "I cannot promise the absence of risk. I don't know how to do that, and I think people who claim to are not telling the truth." She looked at him across the low table. The lamp in the West Wing corner was the same warm amber as the library lamp had been the first evening they sat together in that room. She thought about the person she had been when she walked through the iron gates of this estate with $43 and a worn suitcase and quiet determination, and she tried to measure the distance between that person and the one sitting in this chair, and she found it was both enormous and not what she had expected it to be. She had not become someone different. She had become more completely herself. That was the thing she hadn't anticipated. "My mother needs the mortgage caught up," she said. "My brother needs a winter coat and school supplies, and probably more than that. I've been away 2 months and things accumulate. I have a salary I've been sending home, and it hasn't been enough." He looked at her. "All right. I'm telling you that so you understand where I'm standing when I have this conversation. I can't afford to be a romantic fool. I can't afford a mistake that costs me this job and leaves me back at zero." "I understand." "Do you?" "Because from where you sit, zero looks different than it does from where I sit." "You're correct," he said, without defensiveness. "It looks entirely different. I don't have standing to tell you otherwise." She breathed. "What are you asking me?" He was quiet for a moment. Not the silence of someone gathering courage. The silence of someone selecting language with care because the language mattered. "I'm not asking you anything tonight," he said. "Tonight you've been through something significant and your elbow is swollen and there are police in my driveway and none of those are conditions under which I intend to have the conversation I would like to have." He held her gaze. I'm asking you not to make any decisions about your situation here until we've both had the opportunity to be in conditions that are not an active crisis. She looked at him for a long time. All right, she said. The legal team arrived at 11. The police interviews were conducted in the formal dining room with Damien's attorneys present and were professional and thorough and lasted until past 1 in the morning. Amara answered everything accurately and completely. She had nothing to conceal, which made the experience less complicated than it might have been. And the lead investigator, a woman in her 40s with the specific patience of someone who had been doing this kind of work for a long time, thanked her at the end with a sincerity that didn't feel procedural. You made some unusual choices tonight, the investigator said, closing her notebook. Most people in your position would have run. Running would have given them what they needed, Amara said. Most people don't think about it that way in the moment. My grandmother raised me to think about things in the moment, Amara said. She said the moment was the only place the thinking actually mattered. The investigator looked at her for a beat. Smart woman. The smartest I've known. She slept 4 hours. Real sleep, which surprised her. The deep immediate kind that comes when the body finally overrides everything else and claims what it's owed. She woke at 6 with daylight coming gray through the cracked window, and her elbow properly painful now that the adrenaline had cleared completely. And she lay still for a moment, taking inventory of herself the way her father had taught her to do on difficult mornings. Starting with the feet. Moving upward. Everything accounted for. Everything present. She got up and dressed and went down to the kitchen. Jean was already there. This did not surprise Amara. She suspected Jean was always already there, had probably been already there since the estate was first built, would be already there at the end of whatever came next. Jean looked at her elbow, which was visibly swollen through the sleeve. Ice pack is in the second drawer. Thank you. Sit. She sat. Jean put the ice pack in her hand and put a cup of coffee in her other hand and sat across from her, and they drank their coffee in the early morning quiet of the kitchen while the estate made its settling sounds around them, and the grounds outside were silver and still. He fired Crail's entire security team this morning, Jean said. Brought in a temporary firm until he can vet replacements. Mrs. Holloway will be running internal operations with expanded authority until further notice. That's good. He also, Jean said, turning her cup slowly on the table, called his legal team at 5 this morning to begin the formal restructuring process on 3 of his primary holdings. She looked at Amara over the rim of the cup. He has been considering this for some time, as I understand it, but he filed the paperwork this morning. Amara held the ice pack against her elbow and said nothing. I'm telling you this, Jean said, because I have been in this house for 15 years, and I have watched that man maintain something that costs him in ways that do not appear on any balance sheet. And this morning, for the first time in 15 years, he looked like a person who had made a decision rather than managed a situation. She set her cup down. I thought you should know. Amara looked at the kitchen window, frost on the glass, light beginning to change from gray to something warmer at the edges. Jean, she said, when you worked for his father, was his father happy? Jean was quiet for a moment. He was a man who had things he loved and things he carried that were too heavy. I think happiness was something he achieved in specific moments rather than as a condition. She considered. He loved this estate. He loved his son. He loved the objects he repaired, which I always thought was because the act of repair reminded him that broken things weren't finished things. She paused. Whether that adds up to happy depends on your definition. What's yours? Jean stood and picked up both cups and brought them to the counter. Choosing the right things and living with the cost, she said. That's as close as I've gotten. The press arrived by midday, not at the gates, which were closed and guarded, but outside them, on the road that ran along the estate wall. Cameras, reporters, the specific organized chaos of people who have gotten hold of a story that contains enough elements to make it irresistible. The previous night's events had generated a police statement that was accurate and minimal, but minimal accurate statements about detained criminal operatives at the estate of a known billionaire were sufficient fuel for the engine. Amara watched from an upstairs window, which was an action she chose and not an accident. Priya came and stood beside her without asking. They're going to find out about you, Priya said, about why you were named specifically. I know. Are you ready for that? Amara thought about it honestly. about what it meant to have her name and her face connected publicly to a man like Damien Ashcroft, and about what the specific texture of that public connection would look like, given who she was and what she looked like, and how the world typically narrated stories that involved a woman like her and a man like him. She thought about the way she had been looked at in the service corridor the night of the first gala, looked over from feet to face as though the face were the least important part. She thought about a lifetime of that look in various forms and from various angles. She thought about Damien saying she had never once been invisible to him, and what that meant when the person saying it was someone whose attention was not easily redirected. "I don't know if ready is the right word," she said, "but I'm not going to hide from it." Priya nodded slowly. "Good." A pause. "For what it's worth, I'm glad you didn't go when he tried to send you away. You knew about that. Jean told me." She almost smiled. Jean tells people things she thinks they need to know. It's her primary management style. Amara thought about calling her mother. The thought had been waiting in the back of her mind since she woke up, patient, understanding that other things needed to happen first, but not willing to be ignored indefinitely. She went to her room at 2 in the afternoon and sat on the edge of her narrow bed with her phone and called the number she knew by heart, because some numbers you never need to look up. Her mother answered on the second ring. "Baby." Just that. Just the word. The voice behind it carrying the full weight of a woman who had been maintaining her composure for 2 months on the strength of weekly calls and text messages, and the faith that her daughter's silence about the hard things meant the hard things were manageable. "I'm okay," Amara said. "I want to tell you something happened here. I'm going to tell you all of it. But I need you to know first that I'm okay, and Marcus is going to have his coat and his school supplies, and the mortgage." "Amara," her mother's voice steady and specific. "Tell me about the coat later. Tell me about last night." She told her. Not everything. The architecture of it, the shape of it, enough that her mother could understand what her daughter had been living inside for 2 months without the kind of detail that would keep a mother awake for the remainder of her natural life. She heard her mother's breathing change twice during the telling, the particular catch of a parent processing retroactive fear, which is the worst kind because it has no outlet in action. When she finished, her mother was quiet for a long time. "The man," her mother said finally. "Damien, is he—" She stopped, started differently. "How does he look at you?" Amara sat with the question, felt it land in the specific place it was designed to land. Her mother had always had the gift of the question that cut directly to the thing you were circling. "Like I'm something he intends to keep," she said. Another pause. Longer this time. "Your father looked at me like that," her mother said quietly. "From the 3rd week. I told myself I was imagining it for 3 months, and then I stopped telling myself that." Her voice had something in it that was made of decades. "It's a particular look. Once you've seen it, you don't mistake it for something else." "No," Amara said. "You don't." "Is he worth the trouble?" Amara looked at the crystal crane on her narrow desk, the restored wing in the afternoon light, the place where the break had been made whole, which was, at this angle, the place where the light caught best. "I think so," she said, "but I'm going to make sure." Her mother made a sound that was approval and amusement in equal measure. "That's my daughter." The formal press conference was Damien's idea, and he told her about it 2 days later in the library, which had become the room where the things between them happened, the room that had accumulated the most of their honest exchanges and seemed now to hold them differently than it held the rest of the estate's air. "I want to make a statement," he said, "public, on record, about the restructuring, about the cooperation with the investigation, about the estate's security breach, and how it was resolved." He was standing at the window again, the posture she knew, but the energy behind it was different, less contained, as though some internal pressure had been released and the space formerly occupied by it was still adjusting. "I want to introduce you." She looked at him. "Introduce me as what?" "As the person you are." He turned from the window. "I am aware of what the press will make of it. I am aware of the specific commentary that will accompany a photograph of us together, the assumptions, the framing, the particular form of reductive analysis that the media applies to relationships that don't fit the expected shape." His voice was even. "I don't care about that, but I need to know if you do. And I need to know that your answer is honest rather than brave." She thought about it for a real moment, not performing the consideration, actually doing it. I've spent my whole life dealing with people who looked at my body before they looked at my face, she said. People who decided what I was before I opened my mouth. People who underestimated me the way you underestimate furniture. Something useful that blends into the background. She held his gaze. The press is just more of that, more public and louder, but the same fundamental thing. She paused. I've never been invisible to you. I'd like to see what it looks like to not be invisible to the rest of the world. He crossed the room, stopped in front of her, close. She had become accustomed to the proximity, or she had become accustomed to what the proximity produced in her, which was not calm but was something she had made her peace with. He lifted his hand and touched her face the way he had in the service corridor, careful and sure, the hand of a person who understands the weight of what they're holding. I need to tell you something, he said. All right. I placed that camera in the East Corridor the second week you were here, before the crane, before any of it. He held her gaze without apology, but with the transparency of a person who has decided that honesty is the only viable long-term structure. I told myself it was security protocol. It was not security protocol. She looked at him. I know. He studied her face. You knew. I've known for a while. And I'm still here, she said, in your library, in your house, with my elbow in a brace and my mother's mortgage being handled by your legal team and 7 weeks of history between us that I couldn't have predicted and wouldn't undo. She felt her own steadiness, the deep kind, the kind that comes not from the absence of fear, but from the decision that the fear is acceptable. I'm still here, Damien. He kissed her then, in the library, in the amber afternoon light, with the frost on the windows outside, and the estate settling around them into its winter quiet. It was not a dramatic kiss. It was the kiss of two people who have been moving toward each other through several kinds of difficulty and have finally arrived at the same place at the same time and know what that means. She felt him exhale against her, slow and complete, the breath of a man releasing something he had been holding for longer than the last few weeks. The press conference was held 8 days later. Damien stood at the podium outside the estate's east entrance with his legal team and his communications director and 2 detectives from the investigation behind him, and he gave a statement that was precise and honest and managed to be both simultaneously, which was more difficult than it appeared and which she watched him do from 12 feet away with the particular attention she applied to things that mattered. He spoke about the restructuring first, the 3 primary holdings moving to legitimate operational structures. The cooperation with the investigation, ongoing, the security breach and its resolution, in terms that were accurate without being operationally specific. He spoke about the people who had worked in his house and maintained it during a period of significant danger, and he named Jean and Mrs. Holloway and Tobias and Priya. Then he said her name. He said it the way you say something you've been careful with, something you've been holding at the correct temperature. He said that the person who had, in the course of the last 2 months, demonstrated more clarity and more courage than anyone he had paid to provide those qualities was a woman named Amara Brooks, and that she was standing to his left, and that he would like to say something more about her but intended to say it to her privately first, and then to the people who mattered to her before he said it to a camera. The questions from the press were immediate and loud. He took 3 of them, all about the restructuring, and then he stepped back from the podium and turned to her, and the cameras were still running, and the questions were still being shouted, and none of it touched the particular quality of the moment between them. I said I wasn't going to ask you anything until we were in conditions that weren't a crisis, he said quietly. These aren't crisis conditions, she said. No. He reached into his jacket pocket. These are considerably more nerve-inducing than crisis conditions. The ring he produced was not enormous. It was precise. A single stone in a setting that incorporated, she understood immediately from the shape of the base, the design of the crystal crane. The patient one. Transformed into something new while remaining completely itself. She looked at it for a long time. Then she looked at him. The cameras were going. Behind the gates, the press were doing what the press do. Somewhere in Chicago, her mother was watching a live feed on her phone because Amara had texted her 20 minutes ago with 2 words. Watch this. Somewhere inside the estate, Jean was standing in the kitchen doorway with a dish towel in her hand and an expression she would deny having if anyone described it back to her. The man who believed he didn't need anyone, Amara said. not a question, just the shape of it, naming it out loud. "Is standing in front of you," he said, asking. She thought about $43 in a Chicago airport. She thought about iron gates and crystal cranes and the voice behind the forbidden door and a hand over hers on a library table and the specific sound of a man saying thank you, like the word cost him something real. She thought about what her grandmother said. Don't force it. Let it tell you what it needs. It had been telling her for months. She had been listening for just as long. "Yes," she said. The cheer that went up from somewhere behind the press barrier was not polite. It was the spontaneous, uncontrolled sound of people who have been watching something build and have just seen it complete, and it rose over the frozen estate grounds and scattered the birds from the hedges and went up into the December sky and dissolved there. He put the ring on her finger with hands that were completely steady. She thought, so are mine. They were married in May, when the grounds were finally green, in a ceremony that took all afternoon and ran into the evening because both families had things to say, and food to share, and music that didn't end on schedule, which was the best kind. Her mother danced. Marcus, who had grown 2 inches since October, stood beside Damien during the ceremony with the solemn dignity of a 13-year-old who has been asked to do something important and intends to do it correctly. Jean made the wedding cake. 3 tiers. She refused all assistance. Mrs. Holloway cried during the vows, a single tear, managed with great efficiency and acknowledged by no one. In the years that followed, the estate changed. Not structurally. The stone and the iron and the dark timber remained as they had stood for a century. But the quality of it changed, the air of it, the particular atmosphere that a house develops from the people who inhabit it and the choices they make inside it. Warmth came in by increments, the way warmth always does when it's real rather than performed. Amara's mother came for 3 months the first year and stayed for 6 and eventually stopped going back because the room she had been given had a window that caught the morning light exactly right, and the gardens needed someone who knew what they were doing. Amara completed her education. Law, specifically the area of it concerned with labor rights and immigration, because she had sat in enough rooms with enough people like Priya to understand that the gap between good intention and accessible process was where most of the damage happened, and she had the particular stubbornness required to work in that gap without losing her mind. The foundation was registered in her father's name. Raymond Brooks Foundation for Working Families. It was Damien's suggestion. She cried once, briefly, in the kitchen when he told her, and then she dried her eyes and they talked about the operational structure until midnight. Priya, who had stayed on at the estate and been promoted twice, eventually left to run the foundation's Manchester office. She sent a photograph on her first day at the desk. Amara printed it and put it on the wall of her study beside a photograph of her grandmother's hands. 3 years after the night in the service corridor, Amara was sitting at the desk in Damien's study. Their study, the distinction having been resolved through the simple process of her being there often enough that the space reorganized itself around the fact. Going through foundation correspondence when she became aware that she had not moved in 40 minutes, and that the light had changed and that her back was telling her something worth listening to. She looked up. Damien was in the doorway. He had been traveling for 4 days, legitimate business, the restructured kind, and he had come home an hour ago and come directly here without changing his jacket, which was the thing he did when he needed to locate her before he did anything else. She had learned this about him the same way she had learned everything about him, through accumulated observation and the willingness to let the accumulation tell her what it meant. He looked at her the way he had always looked at her. From the beginning, she understood now, from before she knew to look for it. The particular look that said something that did not have a better word than chosen, not rescued, not protected, not positioned, chosen, deliberately. Every day, including the difficult ones and especially the difficult ones, with full knowledge of what it cost and the consistent conclusion that the cost was worth it. She put down the correspondence and stood up. The crystal crane was on the center of the desk where it had been for 3 years, positioned in the light, the same way he had positioned it on that morning when she understood that something between them had shifted beyond retrieval. The restored wing caught the late afternoon sun at this hour and threw a small moving pattern of light across the papers and the desk surface and the wall. His father had called it the patient one. She had called it privately, in her mind, since the night she finished the repair and laid it in the light to check the work. Something else. She had called it simply proof. Proof that broken things were not finished things. Proof that damage carefully addressed became something the original could not have been. Proof that the place where something had broken, if you were honest about it and deliberate with it and willing to do the slow, painstaking work without forcing, became in the end the most beautiful part of the whole. Damien crossed the room and she went to meet him halfway, which was always the right distance, and outside the windows of the estate that had been cold and dark and controlled when she arrived and was now something else entirely. The May grounds were as green as anything she had ever seen.